The city was restless yet silent, a paradox of noise and emptiness. The only sound inside the patrol car was the faint hum of the heater and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Officer Jack Morgan sat quietly, sipping lukewarm coffee, his eyes scanning the dimly lit parking lot of a 24-hour convenience store. His partner, Ethan Harper, a rookie fresh from the administrative department, was inside grabbing snacks. Jack glanced at the dashboard clock. 2:13 a.m. Another hour in the graveyard shift, where the city's shadows stretched the longest. He let out a sigh, tapping his fingers against the wheel. The radio crackled to life, breaking the monotony.
Attention to all units. Report of domestic disturbance at 346 Green River Lane, Central District. Possible violence.
This is 217. We're nearby. En route.
What's up?
He asked, setting the bag on the seat.
Disturbance call. Let's roll.
Ethan didn't argue, though the unease in his expression was clear. He had been with the department for less than 6 months and wasn't accustomed to the unpredictability of night patrols. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the hazy glow of the distant city lights. It sat at the edge of the block, separated from its neighbors by an expanse of tall, unkempt grass and rusted chain-link fencing. A single streetlight flickered above, casting intermittent flashes of illumination over the peeling paint and sagging front porch. Jack slowed the patrol car to a stop a few houses down, keeping the engine running as he surveyed the scene. The house was eerily still, its windows dark and lifeless. No signs of movement, no lights inside, just a void of emptiness. Ethan adjusted his seatbelt, craning his neck to get a better look.
It's quiet.
He murmured.
Too quiet.
Jack replied, his eyes narrowing. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence seemed to amplify the hum of the distant city. The two officers stepped out of the car. The crunch of their boots on the cracked pavement sounded unnaturally loud. Jack instinctively rested his hand on the grip of his holstered firearm, scanning the property for any signs of life. The front yard was a mess. Weeds reached knee-high in some places, and an old tricycle lay rusting near the porch steps. A plastic lawn chair had been overturned, its once bright colors faded to a dull gray. Ethan hesitated at the base of the porch steps.
This place doesn't feel right.
He muttered. Jack shot him a glance.
It's just a house. Let's check it out.
The wooden steps creaked under their weight as they ascended to the front door. Jack knocked firmly, the sound reverberating through the empty night.
No response.
He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Jack glanced at Ethan, whose eyes darted nervously between the door and the darkened windows.
Think it's a prank?
Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
Could be. But protocol says we check.
Jack reached for the doorknob, testing it gently. It was locked. He rapped on the door a third time, his patience wearing thin. The silence that followed was almost suffocating, pressing against them like a physical weight. Just as Ethan opened his mouth to suggest leaving, a scream pierced the stillness. It was sharp and guttural, the sound of pure terror. It came from inside the house. Jack and Ethan froze, their instincts kicking in almost simultaneously. Jack drew his weapon, motioning for Ethan to do the same.
Police! Open the door!
Jack shouted, his voice firm and commanding.
No answer.
Without hesitation, Jack stepped back and delivered a powerful kick to the door. The frame splintered, and the door swung inward with a groan, revealing nothing but darkness. The moment they crossed the threshold, the air seemed to change. It was heavy, damp, and carried an underlying metallic tang that clung to their nostrils. Jack flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness to reveal a narrow entryway lined with faded wallpaper. The patterns on the walls were barely visible, obscured by decades of grime and neglect.
This place smells like a sewer.
Ethan muttered, covering his nose with his sleeve. Jack ignored him, sweeping his flashlight across the room. The entryway opened into a living room on the left. The furniture was sparse, a couch with stuffing spilling out of its cushions, a wooden coffee table warped from moisture, and a small TV with a cracked screen.
Looks abandoned.
Ethan said, lowering his weapon slightly. Jack moved toward the center of the room, stepping carefully over a broken picture frame on the floor. His flashlight caught a family portrait inside it, a man, a woman, and a little girl, all smiling. The glass was shattered, and the frame was stained with something dark and dried.
Stay alert,
Jack said, setting the picture back on the table. The deeper they went into the house, the colder it became. The hallway ahead seemed unnaturally long, its walls narrowing slightly as if the house itself were trying to squeeze them out. The floorboards creaked beneath their weight, each step sounding like a groan of protest. They passed the kitchen, where a single chair sat in the middle of the room, turned away from the table. It faced the wall, inexplicably out of place. A layer of dust covered every surface, but the chair's seat looked clean, as if someone had been sitting there recently.
Jack, look at this.
Ethan whispered, pointing to the floor. Scuff marks trailed from the chair to the hallway, faint but visible in the flashlight's beam. They looked like drag marks, as if something, or someone, had been pulled away.
keep moving,
Jack said, his voice steady but low. The hallway ended at a single door, slightly ajar. Jack pushed it open with the muzzle of his gun, revealing a small bedroom. The flashlight's beam swept across the sparse furnishings, a bed with a tattered mattress, an empty wardrobe, and a nightstand covered in dust. And on the floor, a man lay face down. Jack stepped inside cautiously, his flashlight trained on the figure.
Sir, can you hear me?
He called out. The man didn't move. Jack knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. It was weak but present.
He's alive.
Jack said over his shoulder. Ethan hovered in the doorway, his flashlight darting nervously around the room.
What happened to him?
No obvious injuries.
Jack replied, turning the man slightly. His face was pale, his eyes closed as if in a deep sleep. Ethan reached for his radio.
I'll call for an ambulance.
The radio crackled, but all that came through was static. Ethan frowned, adjusting the frequency, but the static persisted.
What the hell?
He muttered. Jack glanced up.
What's wrong?
No signal. I'll go try from the car.
Ethan said, already backing toward the hallway. Jack nodded, his focus returning to the man on the floor.
Stay close.
Jack called after him. Ethan disappeared down the hallway, his footsteps fading into the distance. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint sound of Jack's breathing. Jack checked his watch. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. And then the noises began. Faint at first, creaks and groans, as if the house were settling. But they grew louder, more deliberate. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from somewhere behind him. Jack froze, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. He turned slowly, aiming the beam toward the open door. The hallway beyond was empty, but the sound persisted, growing closer.
Ethan?
Jack called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. No answer. He checked his watch. Ethan should have been back by now. Leaving the man on the floor, Jack moved back to the front door. He found Ethan there, his hands gripping the door handle.
What are you doing?
It's locked.
Ethan said, his voice tight.
What do you mean, locked? We just came through here.
Jack tried the handle himself. The door didn't budge. He gave it a hard shove, but it was as if the door was fused to the frame. A sound behind them made them both freeze. They turned as one, weapons raised. From the shadows at the end of the hallway, a woman emerged. Her face was pale, streaked with blood, and her eyes darted frantically around the room.
You shouldn't have come here.
She whispered, trembling. Jack lowered his weapon slightly.
Ma'am, are you hurt? We're here to help.
You can't help.
She sobbed, shaking her head.
It won't let you leave.
Before either officer could react, the woman was yanked backward into the darkness. Her scream was cut off as suddenly as it began. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. As Jack and Ethan moved through the house, it became clear that something was wrong. Hallways stretched impossibly long, doors appeared and disappeared, and their own reflections in cracked mirrors seemed to move independently. The whispers began soon after. At first, faint and unintelligible. Then clearer.
Who's there?
Ethan shouted, spinning around. Jack grabbed his shoulder.
Focus. It's messing with us.
But Ethan was unraveling. His hands shook, his breathing quickened, and his eyes darted wildly.
It's not real.
Jack said firmly.
You don't know that.
Ethan snapped. They entered a large, empty room, and the temperature plummeted. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural hum. It was formless yet disturbingly human, its surface writhing with faces, eyes, mouths, and hands emerging and disappearing as if trapped within.
What the hell is that?
Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. The creature surged forward, its many faces screaming in unison. Ethan fired his weapon, but the bullets passed through the entity, hitting nothing. It enveloped him, and Jack watched helplessly as Ethan's body disintegrated into the darkness. Jack ran, his flashlight flickering as the house twisted around him. Doors led to nowhere, hallways looped endlessly, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He stumbled back into the bedroom, where the unconscious man now stood, his face blank and emotionless.
You'll never leave.
The man said, his voice layered with countless others. Jack turned to flee but found himself face to face with the creature. It smiled with 100 mouths. The radio crackled to life.
Unit 217. We have a report of domestic disturbance at 346 Green River Lane.
Jack's scream was the last sound the house absorbed before the shadows closed in.